Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's diplomatic super week is officially underway. President Lee Jae Myung begins with his first ASEAN summit, where he's expected to meet U.S. President Donald Trump and Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi for the first time. But ASEAN is just the opening act. As the APEC Leaders Meeting in Gyeongju approaches, all eyes are on tariff talks with the U.S., evolving security dynamics, Xi Jinping's upcoming visit, and the future of Korea's ties with Japan as well. So to help us break down the key issues, we are joined in the studio by Min Jeong-hun, professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. A big welcome.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is Daniel Connolly, a associate professor of international relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Min. The so-called Super Week diplomacy has officially kicked off, stretching from the ASEAN summit to the upcoming APEC Leaders Meeting as well. So with high-level meetings with Washington and Beijing scheduled during this season, what do you see as top priorities for the Lee administration's diplomatic strategy?
Yes, as you know, Lee Jae Myung government is pursuing national interest-driven pragmatic diplomacy, and it is based on the robust ROK-US alliance. And Lee government has tried to further strengthen the alliance, and it also tried to enhance the trilateral cooperation with the US and Japan. So the Lee government will have a good opportunity to enhance personal trust and bond between the two leaders, South Korea and U.S., and confirm its close relations with the ally. And the President Lee will also have a first meeting with the new Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi at a summit meeting, and have an important momentum to build trust between the two leaders. And in addition, along with the further strengthening its relations with the U.S. and Japan, it's about time diplomatically for South Korea to expand the scope of its pragmatic diplomacy beyond the U.S. and Japan, and therefore it needed to manage favorable relations with other major diplomatic counterparts like China and ASEAN. And as you know, China and ASEAN countries have been the major diplomatic counterparts that South Korea needed to favorably manage its relations, because they are South Korea's important trading partners and play significant roles in the regional peace and stability. So, for example, China is an important trading partner of South Korea, and it can also exert significant influence over North Korean issues. So South Korea needed to manage its bilateral relationships with China in a stable and constructive manner. So facing the diplomatic week, South Korea needed to solidify its relations with the U.S. and Japan, and also needed to expand its diplomatic scope and the level beyond the Korean Peninsula. This week will provide a very important momentum for South Korea's diplomatic movement.
Definitely. So agenda seems to be packed in across all fronts this week. But before that, let's start with the ASEAN, Professor. So this marks President Lee's first debut on the ASEAN stage. What's your take on the significance and the outcomes of his visit to Malaysia?
Yes, ASEAN is an important economic partner of South Korea. And as you know, it's one of the top three, the trading partner of South Korea. And the ASEAN member states are very young and vibrant. And they are also deeply interested in the K-culture, Hallyu, and they have positive perceptions on South Korea. So when we talk about diversifying the diplomacy and trade, number one alternative has been the ASEAN countries. So very important, the diplomatic counterparts for South Korea. And at the Korea's ASEAN summit this time, President Lee presented South Korea's initiatives to strengthen cooperation with ASEAN, and he also asked for support about South Korea's peace efforts on the Korean Peninsula. Specifically, President Lee laid out South Korea's new initiatives to bolster the comprehensive strategic partnership, CSP, made with ASEAN countries last year and proposed hosting a special Korea-ASEAN summit in 2029 to recognize the 40th anniversary of the bilateral relations. Specifically, the CSP vision aims to position South Korea as a C contributor to support youth in Southeast Asia and as springboard for growth and innovation, and the P partner for peace and stability. And President Lee also shared his E&D initiatives with ASEAN member states, standing for exchange and normalization of relations and the denuclearization, which aims at easing tensions and improving inter-Korean relations. And he also asked for their support, ASEAN country support, about peace-building process on the peninsula. And on the sidelines, as you know, President Lee held a summit with the Cambodian Prime Minister to discuss the strategic relationships between the two countries and the pending issues, like the online scam crimes. And last but not least, President Lee also met the Malaysian Prime Minister to discuss ways to further bolster bilateral ties between the two countries. So overall, I think President Lee's participation in the ASEAN summit is providing good momentum for enhancing the cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN.
Definitely a very important opportunity for President Lee too. Now, let's also invite Professor Connolly to the conversation. So, given ASEAN's approach of maintaining balance and autonomy between major powers, especially as U.S.-China rivalry intensifies, what kind of diplomatic gains can South Korea actually expect from the deepening cooperation with ASEAN?
It's a really important question because I think it's not just a problem of Sino-US competition. It's also the fact that great powers are increasingly weaponizing their interdependence over smaller economies. South Korea experienced this with THAAD, with China, and is currently experiencing this with President Trump in the United States. So I think in this kind of era of double threats, ASEAN's whole philosophy of autonomy and balancing great power competition is something that all U.S. allies are suddenly finding very attractive. Canada, for example, is currently undertaking a major effort to diversify its trading relationships with other countries as a way of limiting the damages from U.S. tariffs, and it also is focusing on ASEAN. So I think if South Korea does something similar, by reaffirming and participating in this idea of ASEAN's centrality, Korea can really forge some diplomatic and economic relationships that are independent of the U.S. alliance system, but that don't go directly against U.S. interests. And I think this kind of very pragmatic relationship building can really strengthen South Korea's autonomy. Especially South Korea has a real competitive advantage. Because South Korea is not a great power, many ASEAN nations like Malaysia or Vietnam will feel much more comfortable making deals with South Korea, and they don't have this fear of interdependencies being weaponized like they might with the United States or China. And for example, last year's South Korea's exports to Vietnam, over $50 billion. U.S. exports to Vietnam were only $13 billion. So I think South Korea has a real competitive advantage in the region as a trading partner and as a diplomatic partner going forward.
Right, and that efforts and balance is becoming even more crucial than ever. Now let's switch a little bit to the talks with Washington. So we are aware that working level discussions from both sides are not quite happening at the ASEAN because they're not attending. So it looks like there won't be much room for that there pre-summit. So given that, Professor Min, how likely do you think the tariff issue would be resolved through a top-down approach at Gyeongju?
Well, personally, I think that there's a possibility for the issue to be settled down at the summit, but generally speaking, it seems to be a little bit difficult to reach a final agreement on the trade negotiations between the two countries. As President Lee Jae Myung mentioned during his the media interview, South Korea and U.S. remained deadlocked. on the details of $350 billion investment to the United States. Specifically, the two countries have got different opinions about how to carry out the investment package, like the method, amount, and timeline of the investment, and how to share the losses and divide the dividends. And President Lee also mentioned that, but the discussion is still ongoing, and the delay doesn't necessarily mean that it's a kind of failure. And he also said that he believes that the countries will be able to reach a rational result sooner or later. And meanwhile, the President Trump mentioned that the trade deal between the two countries is pretty close to being finalized. And he also said that he's ready, but South Korea is ready. So just passing the ball on the Korean side. But anyway, as you mentioned, considering that another working level negotiation is unlikely to be held before the bilateral summit between the two countries on Wednesday, it is more likely that the two leaders will make the political decision at the summit. So that's the last hope that the two countries will make the compromise about the trade negotiations, but we will see what will actually happen. But personally, I hope that the two leaders will reach a final agreement and create a win-win situation for both countries.
Right. Let's look forward to that in the coming days. Now, alongside this tariff negotiations, there's been some movement on the security front as well, but it's reported that the U.S. prepares a package deal that ties both security and trade. So, Professor Connolly, how likely is it that Washington might use security cooperation as leverage in this stalled trade negotiations?
I think there's a high chance of it. Even in Trump's first administration, he periodically complained about South Korea being a security free rider, getting defended for free, sort of language that he used quite often. Even during his second presidential campaign, he referred to South Korea as a money machine. So I think in Trump's view, security and trade are part of the same way that South Korea is taking advantage of a benevolent United States. Whether or not this is true, I think both sides have very different opinions. But I think moving forward, South Korea may have some opportunities in the security field. The Lee administration is broadly supportive, I think, of the ROK being more self-reliant. Being more self-reliant in the security arena can give South Korea more long-term independence from similar U.S. pressures. And I think if South Korea can shift from being a purely security consumer, South Korea's defense industries, they're growing, the exports in Europe, also in Southeast Asia, might be indicating that South Korea can become a security provider in the region, at least at the level of defense industries. Also, South Korea's shipbuilding industry is something that the U.S. doesn't have. And I think South Korea could give some of these sort of things on the plate to sweeten the deal and maybe get some compromises in terms of the $350 investments that they promised to the United States. So Trump is most likely going to include security, but it could benefit South Korea in some ways.
Right, if we use it in a transactional manner, you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. Now, let's also shift to China-Korea relations, Professor Min. So, President Xi Jinping is expected to make a state visit to South Korea in more than a decade, and the summit is expected soon. What kind of discussions do you expect to take place between the two?
Well, personally, I think that President Xi Jinping's state visit to South Korea for the first time in 11 years. 11 years will lay the foundation for restoring South Korea-China relations. As I mentioned, the Lee government is pursuing expanding the scope of its pragmatic diplomacy by managing favorably relations with other major diplomatic counterparts like China. And again, China is a very important neighborhood for South Korea in terms of economy and geopolitics. And China also want to restore and enhance its relations with South Korea. As the U.S.-China strategic competition has been intensified, China needed to make sure that the regional major countries like South Korea and Japan do not get too much closer to the United States. South Korea is an important economic partner of China, especially in advanced technologies like the semiconductors. So in the upcoming summit, the two countries, South Korea and China, are likely to focus on relatively easy issues that they can reach an agreement or they can agree to work with, such as human exchange, like visa exemptions, the extension of the visa exemptions, or the economic exchange and the cooperation, like a traditional trade arenas between the two countries, and the North Korean issues. And among the issues, those Korean issues would be very important and very useful agenda that both countries can work with. And North Korean issue, which is very important for South Korea, but it's not one of the vital or the core issue for China. So relatively, China feel more comfortable in terms of the making cooperation with South Korea.
So let's hope for more concrete results then. Now, let's shift to South Korea-Japan's relations, Professor Connolly. So it's been reported that the Leaders Summit is also being arranged between the two with Japan's new Prime Minister Takaichi, known for her hardline views. What do you see as the key factor in stabilizing relations between Seoul and Tokyo?
Yeah, it's not going to be easy, I think. The new Prime Minister Takaichi, she is an ultranationalist. She's frequently mentioned revisionist historical views. Her new coalition partners are also right-wing, so we're going to see an even kind of greater swing to the right than we saw even with previous conservative Japanese administrations. And what this will ultimately do is really maybe increase the cost of President Lee maintaining momentum in Japan-Korea relations, trilateral relationships more generally. Now, will the Japanese ultranationalists kind of provoke issues remains to be seen. It is a coalition government and it's very fragile. It took over a month for the government to even be established. So maybe it's not in their interests to cause many problems with this kind of budding relationship. The second problem, I think, is she's generally in favor of a more assertive and militarized Japanese foreign policy. She has hawkish views on China, especially. This could put some pressure on the Lee administration if, say, Japan and the US team up and pressure Korea to take a position that may anger or aggravate China. So I think President Lee really has his work cut out ahead of him of maintaining momentum with Japan, but not falling prey to these two threats.
A complex one indeed. Now, finally, before we conclude our discussion, so the leaders of the U.S., China, and Japan are all converging at the APEC Leaders Meeting, and many see this as a major test for the Lee Jae Myung administration. So, Professor Min, what kind of strategy do you think will Korea need to maintain balance among these powers to kind of protect its national interests?
Well, Lee Jae Myung government is pursuing again the national interest-driven pragmatic diplomacy, which is based on the strategic environments that the South Korea is facing. As you know, the ROK-US alliance has been the cornerstone in terms of the strong need of defending South Korean security and the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And the Lee Jae Myung government is trying to further strengthen the ROK-US alliance and try to develop it into a future-oriented alliance that is more active and reciprocal. And on the other hand, South Korea also needed to make enhance cooperation with the United States in advanced technologies and strategic industries such as semiconductors, biotech, and AI. As you know, the U.S. is leading the field and try to reshape the global value chain in advanced technologies, and that fields consist of the core of the South Korea's future economic growth and prosperity. So it is inevitable for South Korea to closely work with the foreign runners of the field like US, Japan, and European unions. So it shows that South Korea has a little bit different strategic situations, unlike compared to in the past. In the past, there was a term Gyeongju. It's U.S. for the security and China for economy. But the situation have changed. Of course, still, the South Korea has got the pretty good reliance on the U.S. for the security side, but on the economic side, we got still different situations. So currently we have 안미경세, which means that still the U.S. for security and the U.S. and the advanced countries, the world for the economy and technology. And it shows the totally different strategic environments that South Korea face. So based on the robust relations with the United States, South Korea will manage favorably its relations with China. That is the new normal for South Korea's positions, and that's the overall directions of the Lee Jae Myung government, the foreign policy.
Right, so we'll really have to see how South Korea would navigate this new complex situation moving forward. But thank you so much for your insights, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And we also appreciate your time, Professor Connolly.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.